They thought the land was the asset. They were wrong. Your services are no longer required, Vincent. The words were delivered by Isabella Thorne, the founder's daughter, and they hung in the pin-drop silence of the winery's conference room. The air, usually thick with the scent of fermenting grapes and aging oak, felt sterile, thin. It smelled like her perfume, expensive and synthetic. Across the polished oak table, her husband, Julian, gave a small, tight smile. It was the smile of a man who thought he just won a game he didn't understand. My name is Vincent Castellano. I'm 58 years old. For the last 29 years, I was the estate vineyard manager for Thorne Crest Vineyards. In truth, I was more than that. I was its memory. I was its hands. I was the reason a bottle of Thorne Crest Founders Reserve sold for $450 and had a waiting list 3 years long. Isabella folded her perfectly manicured hands. She was 38, possessed a Wharton MBA, and had inherited the winery 6 months ago upon the death of her father, Arthur. She'd spent most of her life avoiding this place, and now she spoke of it with the detached language of a private equity deck. We're moving towards a more streamlined, data-driven operational paradigm, Vincent, she said, the words clearly rehearsed. Julian will be taking over as the new director of vineyard operations. His background in logistics will bring a fresh, modern perspective. Julian nodded, adjusting the cuffs of his Brioni suit. A $2,000 suit in a room that smelled of earth and time. He had never worked a day outdoors in his life. His idea of agriculture was the organic kale section at Whole Foods. I looked at my own hands on the table. The knuckles were thick, the skin cracked and stained from years of work. They were the hands that had grafted every single one of the proprietary vines in Block G, the ones that produced the Castellano Clone, the grape that had put this vineyard on the international map. They looked out of place on the gleaming wood. My voice, when it came, was steady. I see. We appreciate your years of service, Isabella continued, her tone dismissive, like she was reading a line from an HR script. We've prepared a severance package. 6 weeks' pay. Standard procedure. 6 weeks. For 29 years of my life. For building a legacy she was now claiming as her own brand to be leveraged. Julian leaned forward, his smile widening. It's about the future, Vince. Not the past. We need to scale. Optimize. We can't be held back by old infrastructure. Old infrastructure. That was me. The foundation they were standing on, ready to be ripped out and replaced with something shiny and hollow. But here's what Isabella, with her polished MBA jargon, and Julian, with his perfect suit, failed to understand. The real value of Thorne Crest wasn't in the soil, the Napa Valley address, or the state-of-the-art tasting room her father had built. It was locked away in a series of 22 worn, leather-bound notebooks sitting on a shelf in my small cottage on the edge of the property. And they had just given me the key. If you like stories about quiet expertise beating entitled arrogance, about people who build things getting justice from the people who only inherit them, hit that like button and subscribe right now. You're going to want to see how this one ends. The story of Thorne Crest isn't about wine. It's about value, and who truly owns it. I started here in 1995. I was 29 years old. Arthur Thorne was 50, a man with a vision but struggling vines. The property was beautiful but the soil was challenging, and the existing Cabernet Sauvignon rootstock was underperforming. The first 5 years were a battle. It was just me, Arthur, and a small crew of 4. We fought frost in the spring and heat spikes in August. I missed my daughter's 3rd birthday because we were dealing with a late-season mildew outbreak. I spent Christmas Eve of 1998 walking the rows with a lantern, checking temperatures, praying the fragile new grafts would survive the cold snap. Arthur was a brilliant marketer and a good man, but he knew his limitations. He knew wine, but he didn't know vines. That was my domain. He gave me a simple directive: Vince, make me a grape nobody else has. Something that speaks of this specific place. So I began experimenting. For a decade, I worked on a private project in a small, 2-acre plot we called the nursery. I started with a resilient, local rootstock known for its deep roots and drought tolerance. Then I began the painstaking process of grafting. Taking cuttings from Old World vines, cross-pollinating, documenting every single trial. Most failed. Some produced interesting but unremarkable fruit. But in the spring of 2005, one graft, Trial 734B, produced a cluster of small, dark-skinned grapes with an incredible intensity. That was the one. The Castellano Clone. It took another 7 years to cultivate enough healthy vines to plant a full block. By 2012, we had our first real harvest from it. The wine we made was extraordinary. It had the structure of a great Cabernet but with unique notes of dark cherry, leather, and a distinct minerality that came from the deep roots tapping into the volcanic soil bed. In 2014, the 2012 vintage of our Founder's Reserve, made exclusively from my grape, scored 99 points from the critics. Overnight, Thorne Crest went from a respectable local winery to a global phenomenon. Our revenue jumped by 300% in 2 years. The price of that bottle went from $80 to $450. All of it was built on my work. My knowledge. The winery owned the physical vines, yes. But the genetic map, the decades of trial and error, the precise knowledge of which rootstock was compatible with which clone, under which soil conditions, that existed in only one place, my notebooks. I remember a conversation with Arthur back in 2008. We were sitting on the porch of my cottage, drinking a beer after a long day. He was getting older, and his mind was turning to legacy. "Vince," he said, swirling the bottle in his hand, "lawyers are gonna draw up papers. Trust and corporations and all that garbage. But this place, its soul is in your head and in those damn books of yours." He looked me straight in the eye. "The work is yours. The knowledge is yours. Don't ever let anyone take that from you. Keep your own records. Separate. You never know." He knew his daughter. Isabella had visited maybe twice a year, always treating the vineyard like a charming but slightly dirty backdrop for her life. She talked about brand equity and market penetration. She never once asked about the soil's pH or the budding cycle. Her husband, Julian, whom she married 2 years ago, was worse. A former hedge fund analyst who'd been pushed out of his firm, he saw the winery as his personal kingdom in waiting. He'd walk through the vineyard talking on his phone about stock prices, his polished loafers sinking into the dirt I'd spent my life cultivating. He didn't see vines, he saw assets. He saw me as a cost center to be eliminated. The fatal mistake they made was one of pure arrogance. They assumed my knowledge was a company asset, like a tractor or a fermentation tank. They never bothered to read the original employment contract I signed with Arthur back in 1995. It was a simple, 2-page document drafted by Arthur's old country lawyer. It had no intellectual property assignment clause. It never occurred to Arthur to include one. To him, our relationship was a partnership, a handshake. He trusted me, and I trusted him. He believed a man's work was his own. That old-world belief was about to become Isabella and Julian's nightmare. The U.S. government, specifically the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB, has very strict rules about what you can put on a wine label. If you sell wine across state lines, you need federal label approval. For standard grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay, it's straightforward. But for a proprietary, non-standard varietal like the Castellano Clone, you have to prove what it is. You need to provide documentation of its genetic origin, its parentage, and the specific rootstock it's grafted onto. This is to ensure authenticity and to track disease-resistant qualities. Arthur and I had filed the initial paperwork years ago, using my preliminary notes. But the detailed, generation-by-generation genetic records required for ongoing certification and verification for new plantings? The master documents? They existed only in my notebooks. We had an understanding. I was the steward of that knowledge. The corporate files had basic harvest logs and vineyard maps, but nothing that would satisfy a TTB audit for a unique, trademarked clone. Without my records, the Castellano Clone was, in the eyes of the federal government, an unsubstantiated mystery grape. And you can't build a $168 million national distribution business on a mystery grape. My personal stakes were simple. My cottage was tied to my employment. My pension was based on my final 5 years of salary. My entire life, my identity, was woven into the fabric of this land. Firing me wasn't just taking my job, it was an attempt to erase me. They thought I would take my 6 weeks of pay, my pat on the head, and shuffle off into obscurity. They misjudged me completely. I am a patient man. I've spent years waiting for a vine to mature. I could wait for this to play out. After they escorted me to my cottage to pack my personal belongings, I didn't panic. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The anger was there, a hard knot in my stomach, but it was a quiet, focused anger. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, sat at my simple wooden desk, and took out the 22 notebooks. The pages were filled with my cramped handwriting, with diagrams of leaf patterns, notes on sugar levels, soil temperature readings, and complex grafting charts that looked like cryptic family trees. This was my life's work. My legacy. And now, it was my weapon. My first call was to a man named David Chin, an intellectual property lawyer in San Francisco who specialized in agricultural patents and trade secrets. I'd met him at a viticulture conference years ago. I explained the situation calmly, factually. I emailed him a copy of my 1995 employment contract. He called me back 2 hours later. "Vincent," he said, his voice crisp and clear, "you are in an incredibly strong position. Your original contract is a beautiful thing. It's a relic from a time when a man's word meant something. There is no work-for-hire language, no IP assignment. These notebooks, containing your unique methodologies, your undocumented data, they are unequivocally your personal property. They constitute a trade secret. They can't force you to turn them over." Meanwhile, back at the winery, Julian was playing king. The first thing he did was issue a press release. It was filled with nauseating corporate speak about pivoting to the next generation of consumer, and a strategic realignment of our core assets. He announced himself as the new director of vineyard operations. He even gave an interview to a wine blog where he talked about his vision for introducing more tech-forward solutions to the vineyard. He wanted to install soil sensors and use drones. He had no idea that I could tell more about the soil's moisture content by crumbling a clod of dirt in my hand than his $1 million sensors ever could. He and Isabella celebrated their victory. They hosted a lavish dinner for some industry people in the main house. They poured the 2018 Founders Reserve, the wine made from my grapes, and toasted to a new era of leadership. They were so blinded by their own perceived brilliance that they never once stopped to ask the most fundamental question: where are the blueprints? They saw the beautiful building but never thought to check who held the deed to the foundation. Their arrogance was my shield. They didn't know what they didn't know, and their pride would never let them admit it. The first sign of trouble for them came about 3 weeks later. It was a small thing. The irrigation system in Block C, which sits on a patch of clay-heavy soil, needs a very specific watering schedule to prevent root rot. I'd always managed it manually. Julian, in his wisdom, had put everything on a new, automated system he'd bought for $92,000. He set the whole vineyard to the same schedule. The vines in Block C started showing the first signs of stress, a slight yellowing of the leaves that only a trained eye would notice. Then a bigger problem arose. The team in the cellar was preparing to bottle the 2023 vintage. It had been a challenging year with a late heat wave, and the blend required a delicate touch. The cellar master, a good man named Miguel whom I had trained myself, knew the percentages weren't quite right. He went to Julian for guidance. Julian, having no idea what to do, pulled a generic blending chart off the internet. Miguel knew it was wrong, but he had his orders. The resulting blend would be good, but it wouldn't be great. It wouldn't be a 99-point wine. I heard about all this through the grapevine, quite literally. Miguel and I still talked. He was loyal to the vineyard, but he knew who had built it. He told me they were flying blind. The real emergency, the one I was waiting for, arrived 6 weeks after my termination. It came in the form of an email from their largest national distributor, a company called Prestige Wines. They represented 40% of Thorne Crest's annual sales. Their purchase order for the next fiscal year was for 15,000 cases of the Founder's Reserve. A deal worth, at wholesale, approximately $128 million. It was the contract that kept the entire operation afloat. But to ship that wine out of California, they needed to get their new 2023 label approved by the TTB. The application was submitted by their compliance officer. A week later, it was rejected. The email from the TTB agent was polite but firm. Application for Thorne Crest Founders Reserve 2023. We require updated and complete documentation for the proprietary varietal listed as Castellano Clone, including full genetic lineage and rootstock certification, as per TTB Regulation 434A. The documentation on file is insufficient for renewal. Panic. Isabella and Julian tore the office apart looking for the files. They searched every digital server, every filing cabinet. All they could find were my basic planting maps and harvest logs. There was nothing about grafting lineages, nothing about the decade of experiments in the nursery block, nothing that would satisfy the federal government. The distributor's deadline was in 60 days. If they couldn't ship, they would be in breach of contract, facing not only the loss of $128 million in revenue but also a massive penalty clause and the destruction of their most critical business relationship. Thorne Crest was about to be legally trapped in California. Their national brand would be worthless. That's when I got the call. It was Isabella. Her voice was strained, the corporate polish gone. "Vincent. We need to talk. Can you come to the winery this afternoon? 3 o'clock. I arrived at 2:58 p.m. I walked into the same conference room where they had fired me. The power dynamic, however, had shifted entirely. Isabella and Julian were there, along with a man in a sharp suit I recognized as Harrison Croft, the head of their corporate law firm. They looked tired. Stressed. The confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle anxiety. I sat down in the same chair. I placed my old leather satchel on the table beside me, but I didn't open it. Isabella tried to start, her voice attempting a friendly tone that didn't land. "Vincent, thank you for coming. Look, it seems there's been a bit of an organizational oversight. Some files appear to be missing. Specifically, some of the older records regarding the rootstock in Block G." Julian jumped in, unable to help himself. "Just some of your old farm notes," he said, forcing a casual air. "We need them for a compliance filing. We want to digitize everything, bring it into the 21st century." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. Then I looked directly at Isabella. "You mean my notebooks?" A wave of relief washed over her face. "Yes, exactly. Your notebooks." I nodded slowly. "Those notebooks are my personal property. They document nearly 3 decades of my intellectual labor, my proprietary methods, and my trade secrets." Croft, the lawyer, shifted in his seat. He knew. He had obviously reviewed my employment contract by now and understood the catastrophic hole his clients were in. "Vincent," he began, his voice measured, "the work was performed on Thorne Crest property, using Thorne Crest resources. The winery has a legitimate claim to that data." This was the moment. I had brought my own counsel, David Chin, who had been waiting quietly in the lobby. I gave him a slight nod. He entered the room and took a seat beside me. "Mr. Croft," David said, his tone polite but firm. "I believe you've seen Mr. Castellano's 1995 employment agreement. It was drafted by Arthur Thorne's own counsel. As you know, it contains no intellectual property assignment clause, no work-for-hire stipulation. Under California law, the tangible expression of an idea, in this case, 22 notebooks filled with unique, unrecorded data, belongs to its creator unless explicitly signed away. Mr. Castellano has signed nothing." The color drained from Julian's face. Isabella stared at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. The Wharton MBA hadn't prepared her for this. She had analyzed balance sheets and market trends, but she had never once considered the value of the man whose hands produced the very product her entire enterprise was built on. I finally spoke, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. The winery owns the vines in the ground. I have no dispute with that. But the knowledge of what they are, how they were created, and the legal documentation of their origin required for you to sell your wine outside of this state, that belongs to me. You terminated my employment without cause. You offered me 6 weeks' pay for a lifetime of work. So no. I will not be turning over my notebooks. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the cooling units in the cellar below us. They were trapped. Their multi-million-dollar business, their reputation, their future, it was all sitting in a leather satchel on the table, and they couldn't touch it. The negotiation took less than an hour, because it wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender. David Chen laid out my terms. They were not suggestions. They were conditions. First, David stated, looking at a single sheet of paper, Mr. Castellano will be granted a 49% equity stake in Thorne Crest Vineyards, LLC, effective immediately. He does not want controlling interest. He wants to be a partner, not a CEO. Isabella gasped. 49%. Nearly half of her inheritance, her company. Second, David continued, Mr. Castellano will be reinstated under a lifetime contract as Director of Viticulture. He will have absolute and final authority on all matters related to the vineyards, the cellar, and the winemaking process. His decisions will be non-overridable. His new salary will be $350,000 per year, indexed to inflation. My previous salary had been $165,000. Third, Julian Thorne will be removed from any and all managerial and operational roles at this winery. His title will be stripped. He is not to give any directive to any employee ever. He can remain a silent, non-voting beneficiary of his wife's remaining shares, but his involvement in this business is over. Julian looked like he'd been struck. He started to speak, but Isabella shot him a look that silenced him instantly. Fourth, and finally, David said, the proprietary varietal currently known informally as the Castellano Clone will be officially trademarked and recognized under that name in all marketing, labeling, and legal documentation. The legacy of its creator will be permanently honored. Croft looked at his clients. Their faces were masks of disbelief and fury. But they were cornered. The alternative was ruin. A fire sale of the winery at a fraction of its value. Bankruptcy. Public humiliation. Isabella looked at me, her eyes searching for some weakness, some opening to argue. She found none. My face was granite. After a long, tense minute, she gave a single, sharp nod. We agreed to the terms. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The lawyers drew up the papers that very afternoon. I signed the documents that made me part owner of the place I had poured my life into. Then, I opened my satchel, took out a single, specific notebook, number 17, and handed them a notarized copy of the 3 pages the TTB required. Their compliance officer filed it an hour later. The label was approved within 48 hours. The $128 million shipment went out on time. Julian was a ghost. He was stripped of his title and his corner office that same day. He was humiliated, rendered completely powerless. He spent a few months shuffling around the tasting room, trying to look important, but the staff ignored him. They all knew what had happened. They knew who held the real power. Within 6 months, he and Isabella separated. Last I heard, he was selling luxury condos in Miami, back to a world of shiny surfaces and empty promises. Isabella remained as CEO, but her authority was neutered. She ran the marketing and the finances, but the heart of the company, the wine itself, was my domain. Our relationship is professional, cold, and efficient. We are partners, bound not by trust, but by necessity. She learned a hard lesson in value. As for me, life changed and yet stayed the same. I moved back into my cottage, though now I owned half of everything I could see from my porch. I used my new salary to pay off my daughter's college tuition in full. The financial security was a comfort, but the real victory wasn't the money. It was the recognition. It was the justice. The first batch of bottles that went out with the newly approved label had it right there, in small but elegant print below the founder's reserved title, made exclusively from the Castellano Clone. My name was on the bottle. My legacy was secure. I still walk the rows every morning at dawn, just as I always have. I run the soil through my fingers, I check the new buds, I listen to the vines. They are my partners. Arthur always said the land remembers. It remembers who cared for it, who nurtured it, who respected it. And in the end, it pays its debts. Value isn't created in a boardroom with buzzwords and spreadsheets. It's not inherited or acquired. It's grown, over decades, with patience, with sweat, with dirt under your fingernails, and with knowledge earned line by line. Never let anyone tell you that's not worth everything. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story of corporate karma, smash that like button, leave a comment letting me know what you think, and be sure to subscribe. Hit that notification bell, because I have a lot more stories about cheaters and arrogant bosses getting exactly what they deserve, and you won't want to miss a single one.